Okay, I think right. Can we switch spots?
Oops. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to First Person. The Barnard Zine Library staff is going to be sharing, is going to be illuminating a range of zines that talk about the long-term impacts of redlining from lots of different points of view. But before we get started, I just want to thank the Undesign team, the AV team, anyone else who's been providing support, and also the zine creators. We reached out to most of the creators that we're going to be speaking about, and they enthusiastically gave their consent. So because we've got a lot to cover, I'm just going to turn it over to our first presenter, who is Grace. So this is Grace Lee.
Hi everyone, I'm Grace. I use she, they pronouns, and I chose the zine And Now My Watch Begins, almost 8 years of sobriety my way, aka Staying Sober While Staying Woke by Collier. To put this issue in context of the series that it was published in, Collier has a 2017 issue that focused on dating while sober, staying sober in the age of public Black executions, and why compulsory labels of addict and alcoholic are racist. And then the 2018 issue looked at alternatives to the 12-step method to recovery, the genocide of Black and Native American people, and queer-baiting corporations. That brings us to 2019, which is the issue I will be talking about today, that focuses on gentrification, finding recovery meetings in new homes, sobriety under COVID-19, coping with heartbreak, and so much more. This presentation will focus specifically on the aspect of gentrification and its effect on recovery, as well as Collier's recovery justice framework. Collier explores how the cities and Black metropolitan refuges that they depend on for spiritual reprieve and sustenance were being fundamentally violated by the influx of white and non-Black people of color into historically Black communities and pushing out the previous residents. For Collier, the effects of gentrification can be seen as the loss of community space, of spiritual, cultural, and emotional refuge and survival. Through white and non-Black POC co-opting traditions and cultural practices, the constant anxiety about the loss of sanctuary through state-prompted violence weighs on their recovery and illustrates how gentrification and recovery are deeply intertwined. The quote, "How long will it be before there are no Black folks here either, until I get pushed out and can't afford to live here anymore, pushed out by white and non-Black POC trying to save a buck in the neighborhood I live in for safety, community, and survival." This quote really illustrates how gentrification affects more than where someone lives, but also this one's safety, community, and survival. Additionally, Collier talks about having their experience through many recovery programs in different areas and explores the whiteness of these meetings, not only in the attendance, but also in the leadership and the centering of the white experience. Collier said that this included the dismissal or polite but truly empty and dazed looks they received while speaking about the ways different modes of oppression affected their recovery process. This quote really illustrates how gentrification can affect the formation of these recovery spaces across class, race, gender, and other identities, and also exacerbate the issues of whiteness in recovery spaces. Collier found SMART, a recovery program that was based out of the LGBT Center in Chelsea. They found that the meeting was both secular but not anti-faith, that was able to be worked alongside other programs, and that it actively speaks out against the compulsory use of the term addict and alcoholic. the use of current findings, advances in neuroscience and behavioral health, instead of being rigidly based on religious, pseudoscientific musings of white, cis, heterosexual Christian man in the 50s, which is what the 12-step recovery method is based off of. While the space was supportive in many aspects of Collier's identity and recovery, Collier also reflected on how their identity of being trans and non-binary, as well as pansexual, were often overlooked or met with discomfort. So after having to leave SMART, Collier began their own journey to finding and fostering a recovery program that validated the experiences of Black, queer, trans, and non-binary people. To find support, Collier turned to their ancestors and shares the importance of legacy and lineage. One of the lines that really stood out to me the most in this section was, "There's the legacy of creative resilience and resistance of African American people and Black people across the diaspora, including on the continent that is as old as humanity itself and has survived across the millennia." This quote really illustrates the importance of understanding one's part as part of a lineage of people and looking towards others within the lineage as guides to one's own recovery. This lineage that Collier refers to also raises questions about how gentrification and forced displacement affect the formation of community histories. Sorry. Sorry. Collier ends the zine with this message. "So whenever you're reading this, friend in the future, know that I am rooting for you on every effort you are making to increase wellness and health in your life. It is not easy and we'll never do it perfectly, but I believe in you, me, and everyone else on this path. I hope you have all the support and resources you need to get where you want to be." I chose this scene because of how Collier explores the effects of gentrification on recovery, as well as some of its alternatives to the prescriptive method of the 12-step recovery program that was designed for white, cis, heterosexual men, and also the exploration of their own experiences within different recovery spaces. Some questions that I was interested in exploring through the scenes were, what are some ways that gentrification affects recovery and how the recovery justice framework can be applied to different areas? Thank you so much, and I'll pass it along to the next Zine Librarian.
Yay, Grace.
Yay, great. Hello. I'm Nayla Delgado. I'm a sophomore at Barnard and an associate zine librarian. And the zine that I'll be looking at is No History, No Self by Johanna. And in No History, No Self, Johanna, a half Filipino, half Finnish person, discusses their experiences moving from New York City to England in 2009. As they struggle to get accustomed to their surroundings, Johanna analyzes issues relevant to people of color, such as identity, displacement, mental illness, and gentrification. I chose this scene because it really related to a lot of my experiences with displacement as a person of color. And in particular, the title spoke a lot to me. Here's how Johanna explains the title. The name comes from a quote by Filipino American community activist Mel Orpilla: "No history, no self. No history, no self." It seemed appropriate given how I feel like an unknown quality in the UK, and also how I feel cut off from communities that help me know my family's histories and cultures. So one of the questions that Johanna asked in their zine is, are we gentrifying? Here's an excerpt from the zine. "So we live in a neighborhood, Easton, that has a rep for being dangerous. Maybe not as bad as it used to be a few years ago. Yet I mentioned that this is also a neighborhood with lots of people of color. Are we gentrifying? We are two middle-class privileged people, white and sometimes passing for white. And there certainly seem to be other middle-class folks, white or not, in this neighborhood. So gentrification is often a racialized narrative, oversimplified as a black and white issue, when the reality is a lot more complex. Johanna, like many others, struggles to reckon their role in this community, and it raises important questions about the role of middle and upper class people and people of color that play in gentrification. Morgan Jerkins, a Columbia professor, wrote an article, "I'm a Black gentrifier in Harlem, and that's not a good feeling," for The Guardian. And I think this excerpt also really enlightens these issues from a New York perspective. The biggest misconception is that gentrification arrives in the form of rich white men in suits. In 1964, British sociologist Ruth Glass pinned down the term to describe the influx of middle-class people who displaced lower-class workers. Since the African middle class is broadening, how can we not discern the different strata of Black life and how they conflict with one another? We are here, we have a martini at the Cove Lounge, or sit in the pews at one of the famous Black churches, but we are not of the community, we are transplants. And if we're not the community, what are we? Another issue relating to gentrification that Johanna brings up is veganism. It was one of the things that drew them to the specific neighborhood that they ended up staying at. And the excerpt says, "I am pleased at how vegan friendly the area is. There's a radical social center that does vegan meals on weekends, plus a fancy veg restaurant for those times we really want to splurge. But I wonder how much the local people of color are involved in either of those spaces. I wonder why, in these two instances anyway, it seems like veganism as performed publicly in these spaces is not necessarily something that the local people of color are seen involving themselves with." So in this discussion of gentrification, Johanna raises an interesting connection between vegan restaurants as signifiers of gentrification. And since 2009, when this zine was written, veganism has become increasingly mainstream and thus more profitable for businesses. And so this has further marked spaces as common signifiers in gentrification. And to really illustrate this issue, I have a data visualization from Catherine Flowen from 2017 that looks at veganism as signifiers of gentrification in San Francisco.
This is San Francisco.
1 second.
These are the vegan restaurants in the Bay Area, and I mean exclusively vegan, no vegetarian or vegan-friendly restaurant. For example, here is the Mission District, an area that has often been at the center of the conversation about gentrification over the last several years. This is the neighborhood with the most vegan restaurants. I wanted to know how many vegan restaurants were located in gentrifying areas. In fact, most vegan restaurants in San Francisco are in census tracts that are experiencing advanced gentrification, a total of 46% of vegan restaurants. The rest of the vegan restaurants in San Francisco that aren't in gentrifying areas are in high-income regions that are at risk of losing affordable housing, in turn excluding low-income families.
So as we can see through that visualization, obviously veganism has become intertwined with gentrification in this conversation. And so I want to end on the note of displacement, because displacement in all forms is a complex and emotionally taxing process for people of color. It threatens identity, community, and one's entire way of life. And in conversations about gentrification and housing inequities, it's important to consider the impact on displaced communities. And for middle and upper class people of color specifically, it's also important to consider one's own role in this displacement and ways to help rather than harm our communities. And I'll end on this quote that was the final page of Johanna's zine. And it says, "And I chose peace, not the idealized peace of the summer of love. No lilacs in my hand this time. This is a cold, calculating peace activist. Someone out there wants to kill me, and I have to figure out how to save my own life out of the history I know and the tools that I have." By Marie J. Matsuda, Asian Americans and the Peace Imperative. And thank you, and I'll pass it over to the next zine associate.
Yay, Nayla.
Yay!
Hi everybody, my name is Alekhya and I'm a freshman here at Barnard. And today I'll be presenting the zine Columbia's West Harlem Expansion, a look at the issues. So this zine was published in 2007 by the Student Coalition on Expansion and Gentrification. It's centered around the potential impacts of Columbia's widely touted expansion into Manhattanville, a section of West Harlem. The project was initiated in 2003 and construction began in 2008. And you can see some of the maps outlining the plan here on the slide. I chose this zine for a variety of reasons. First, it connects directly to the Undesign the Redlines piece about the cost of Columbia's growth and expansion, as well as the overarching themes that the exhibit encompasses. In addition, I think that this case provides an excellent opportunity to look at broader concepts such as gentrification, rezoning, and displacement in practice. And it forces us to consider their impacts in our own neighborhood and to examine the role of academic institutions in perpetuating systemic inequities. So the zine is available to read in our library. We have a physical copy here and in a PDF online, and I posted a link to that in the chat. So there's a stark contrast between the way Columbia University presents the expansion project and the way the Student Coalition characterizes it. Columbia University's website states, starting in 2003, Columbia began working with leaders in West Harlem to develop a thoughtfully designed, predictable development blueprint to provide the kind of middle-income jobs to New Yorkers that had largely been shed by the decline of private industry. In contrast, SCEG states, Columbia is a mostly white university that has proposed building a new campus in a neighborhood whose residents are predominantly people of color. The university's past developments are largely responsible for the transformation of Morningside Heights from a racially and economically diverse neighborhood to an affluent white one. Columbia markets itself on the basis of the racial diversity of its student body and of surrounding neighborhoods, but it does so without demonstrating respect for people of color or commitment to their well-being. After its initial mission statement, the zine begins with a brief glimpse into Columbia University's history. In the 1960s, the university requisitioned property and land to build its campus in a way that left the surrounding community deeply scarred. It also introduces the 197A plan, which they define as a set of guidelines created by the West Harlem community to inform and promote redevelopment in the neighborhood that recognizes and supports its needs. So on the screen here, you can see a graphic that was pulled from an article published by Columbia Magazine that shows some of the highlights of the new expansion plan, such as the Lenfest Center for the Arts and the Forum. Throughout the rest of the zine, the 197A plan kind of serves as a contrast to Columbia's expansion plan. It's a situation of what we're doing versus what we should be doing. There are 5 key principles that guide the 197A plan. The plan identifies the need to improve the quality of life of residents, preserve historical building patterns, encourage the creation of job-intensive businesses, allow for population growth in a manner that promotes diversity of incomes and ethnicity without displacement, and lastly, to improve social, cultural, and economic opportunities for residents by encouraging redevelopment. The zine ends with a section that compares West Harlem's 197A plan with Columbia's expansion plan, and the finer points of this comparison are on the slide here. It highlights some of the debilitating impacts of the project, such as a loss of jobs and affordable housing, biosafety hazards, and changes to the historic West Harlem architectural landscape. One of the most interesting sections in the zine for me personally is the one explaining eminent domain and its relevance to the case. Eminent domain is essentially confers power to the government and public agencies to lay claim to private property and to turn it into something for public use or for the public good. Columbia is a private institution, so the university itself can't exercise eminent domain, but the government can on the university's behalf. SCEG is very critical of the use of eminent domain to obtain property in this case, stating that any honest negotiations have to be based on a spirit of compromise and mutual respect, not on the threat of force. So it's been several years since the publication of the zine in 2007, and since then there have been many developments in this case. And so I just wanted to do some research and present some updates on where we're at now. So in the early 2000s, Columbia was in the process of acquiring the land that it needed from private property owners in the Manhattanville area. However, there were 2 holdouts who refused to sell. These 2 residents, Nick Spray Regent and Gurnam Singh, filed separate lawsuits against the university. Despite some initial victories for the plaintiffs, the courts ruled in 2009 and 10 that the use of eminent domain was applicable in this case and that Columbia had a right to expropriate the land. So now in 2021, construction is ongoing and the project has really taken shape. Some of the buildings have been completed or are close to completion. So in this slide, you can see some of the recently completed buildings from the expansion project on the left. And on the right, you can see some of the historic West Harlem buildings that were demolished to make way for them. So I think it's really interesting that along with changes in demographics due to gentrification and displacement, you can see a physical change in the landscape as it modernizes. So in the years since the publication of the zine, Columbia has signed a community benefits agreement, which includes allocating millions of dollars for redevelopment, affordable housing, and housing legal assistance, as well as paying money to women and minority-owned construction firms. However, it's impossible to ignore the impact that this project will have and has already had on the community. For example, consider the plaintiff in one of the 2007 cases brought against the university, Gurnam Singh. Singh is a Punjabi immigrant who arrived in the United States in 1981. He was a dishwasher in a restaurant for many years until he and his brother saved up enough money to buy several gas stations, one of which stood on the property that Columbia desired. Singh faced tragedy and hardship after moving to America, as many disenfranchised immigrants do. Despite losing his brother in an armed robbery, he continued to run his businesses. However, Columbia University's involvement in West Harlem was devastating to the family. According to a New York Times article, Singh asserted that Columbia had relentlessly pressured them to sell their property and that university representatives had threatened them. He also said that university representatives were treating me like this is an Indian family and we don't know anything. The stress of the situation was detrimental to Singh and his wife's health. He wound up in the hospital for several weeks due to exhaustion, and his wife suffered from stress-induced shingles. The trajectory of Singh's life is a prime example of the American dream story playing out. So there's a kind of acute symbolism in the fact that Columbia, a PWI with a long history of elevating privileged white men, precipitated its end. It's illustrative of the ways in which people of color, particularly those who are immigrants, are often powerless in the face of expansion and gentrification. For me personally, there's a kind of contradiction inherent in this case. Like Singh and his wife, my parents are Indian immigrants who came to this nation destitute and spent a quarter of a century pouring their souls into building a life here. My status as a person of color and as a first-generation American constitutes an enormous part of my identity. On the other hand, I am, just as all of you are, a member of an institution that undeniably contains and contributes to systemic divides. It's difficult to reconcile this tension, and it forces all of us to ask the question of ourselves, to what extent can we both be a part of and be combaters of these issues? Thank you very much.
Hey, Alekhya.
Hi everyone, I'm Mikako, she, her pronouns, and I'm a senior at Barnard studying urban studies. The zine that I chose to present today is called Don't Move, Improve, Banana Kelly. Next slide. So the zine was written by Sharon Daynab when she was a freshman at the City College of New York in 2017. And it was part of a writing seminar taught by Professor Nandini Bakshi. She was born and raised in Astoria, Queens, and she talks later in the zine about her own experience with displacement and redlining. What is Banana Kelly? Banana Kelly is a community improvement association that started operating in February of 1978, and it got its name because the neighborhood that it operated on is in the shape of a banana. Next slide, please. So the zine is formatted in a very accessible way. At the top, I've included the timeline that Sharon uses throughout the zine to locate the information in time. And she also uses these fun little graphics noting the history and the present. Next slide, please. So 1970s New York. So due to the fiscal crisis in the 70s, along with rapid suburbanization going on and white flight in New York, the city slowly became abandoned. In the Bronx, landlords would often burn down buildings and even outsource and recruit youth in the area to burn down these abandoned buildings that no longer made the landlords any profit. So that led to firefighters, ambulances, and other emergency, or even just like sanitary departments in the city to neglect these areas. So the Bronx slowly became divested and had lots of decaying infrastructure. And so by the end of the 70s, Sharon writes that 80% of the homes in the area were burned down, and that led to over 100,000 people being homeless. So this is where Banana Kelly comes in, as she draws Banana Kelly to the rescue. Banana Kelly's first project was in the 1970s, and they repaired 3 buildings. And they actually used loans and funding provided by various donors, but also the government. But since the organization was not really making money to pay back these huge loans, Banana Kelly eventually fell into mass loan debt. Next slide, please. After a period of changes in authority, and also the transformation of the city of New York, Banana Kelly still operates to this day as a housing development association / charity. So today they own around 23 buildings in the Bronx. And Sharon actually visits one of the buildings in the zine. It's located in Hunts Point, and she spoke to board members about Banana Kelly's current mission. So some of the facts and policies that she lists on the left side, or that you can see on the left side of the screen, were that 65% of the residents come from homeless shelters. Banana Kelly does not kick out residents due to financial incapabilities. And then they have no tolerance for illegal actions. And lastly, it's around $800 for a 2-bedroom apartment, which is very good in New York City, sadly. Sharon also includes some of the various community programming efforts that Banana Kelly does. So one of them, the photo you can see, is a community garden. Another one that they hosted is a community Thanksgiving, which is coming up actually. And then they also had a red carpet event where food was distributed to people who walked down a red carpet, and it made the residents feel confident and beautiful, and we got their food, so it was fun. Next slide, please. So I chose this zine because the topic fits well with the Undesign exhibit, also because of the breadth of info that Sharon provides. It's really amazing the amount of research she did as a freshman in this writing seminar. And she also does it in a very accessible format. So you saw in the presentation, some of the drawings that I included were Sharon's drawings of various doodles and her own like artistic flair. She also included lots of photos, and she annotated her own text blurbs, which is a nice touch. I also wanted to use this opportunity to highlight student work that talked about their own housing stories. So at the end of the zine, Sharon spends around like a page talking about how she moved from Astoria to Virginia and then back again, but could no longer afford the same apartment that her family used to live in. So I really enjoy that personal connection aspect at the end of the zine. And yes, she also provides a list of sources at the end of the zine for readers to look into, which I thought was a great, I guess, segue for people to learn more about these topics. Next slide, please. So that leaves me with a few thoughts and questions. Starting with, how can organizations like Banana Kelly combat the consequences of redlining? And then how do you maintain a safe space while still answering to capitalism's call? So that's kind of going back to Banana Kelly's struggle to pay back these loans because they aren't making profit on their kind of housing developments, but also they don't want to evict people. So balancing those two priorities. Sharon also includes a question about gentrification and how Banana Kelly could possibly, or Banana Kelly and other housing developments that are kind of renovating and clearing land, how these organizations might actually contribute to gentrification. And then to address sort of the personal aspect that I enjoyed, The zine brought up questions about my own housing story, and also I encourage you all to think about your own housing story. So yeah, thank you so much.
Great. So I'm up next. I'm Claudia. I use they, she pronouns. Not a Barnard student, but I'm the zine tech, and I'm a library school student at Queens College. So I decided on this personal zine, Godzilla Girl, A Journey to the Wall by Monstro Chica. She sort of writes about her like journey as an artist as a teenager, sort of getting into like feminist street crews and graffiti, but also like changing like beautification projects and like scenery and street art sort of becoming mainstream around this period, and art washing, etc. So I'll introduce what art washing is. It's very much like, pink washing or whitewashing, and it's essentially when when real estate entities use cultural capital to rebrand their luxury developments, when corporations hire artists to put up murals, commercial or otherwise, to beautify a community. And this usually results in the rise of property value, sort of raising interest level for like wealthy, like transplant tenants or real estate developers or business owners. Patty, who's a tenants' rights organizer in Bushwick, part of an organization called Mi Casa No Su Casa, in an interview says, art washing is what's used by a lot of real estate developers to accelerate the gentrification of an area. It's when art is commodified in a community, specifically working class POC communities. And then this banner drop here is from a protest that Mi Casa No Casa had held in Bushwick a few years ago. Naomi Martinez, growing up in Chicago, not New York, before she sort of picked her like arts name and was like kind of getting into art, kind of discovering what she was into, was just she describes herself as a kind of like listless teenager, a little bit lost, trying to find mentorship in what was at the time a really tight knit, really like men led, made up of mostly men, like graffiti art scene. She says in the zine, I wanted to learn to spray paint more than ever, but I never found a mentor within the crew. I soon found out that none of the girls were doing any tagging or painting themselves. They would hook up with a tagger and get their names thrown up. When I found out about that, I saw everything in a different light. I didn't want to continue hanging around these kids that could care less about me. She starts to get to know other like graffiti artists who are kind of like showing her the ropes, not really. And she is, afraid of being rejected by them. I learned that I wanted to paint characters, but I didn't share this with them. I was worried they'd reject me. Around this time, she's also just sort of noting the changing demographics of the neighborhoods that she's growing up in and spending time in, and the ways that this affects graffiti art that she sees, or like graffiti art that her friends are making. At the top, she says, graffiti art popped up less and less along the Blue Line in the late 90s as gentrification was slowly creeping up on Milwaukee Avenue. Now all I saw were condominiums rising from the ground left and right. The landscape was changing inside the trains too. More and more white well-to-do students and professionals were moving into the city and traveling by train. And around this period of time, she's starting to, get to know the local scene and like painting in public or participating in like public art, like live painting exhibitions. And she describes like misogyny that she experiences from like other artists. A well-known local male graffiti artist started interrogating me and asking me, so you're a graffiti artist? Really? But really, are you? I told him that I never called myself a graffiti artist. He was trying to intimidate me, embarrass me. Well, it worked. There's this sort of, misogynist gatekeeping, but also sort of like protective, possessive gatekeeping over like new people unfamiliar with like the social dynamics of the scene going in to sort of commodify the art. She sort of notes like a shift in like mainstreaming sort of this art style and public art sort of at the bottom here. a growing dislike for a new type of graffiti called street art and a new breed of street artist was on the rise. While having no relation to graffiti artists, they are being hailed as such and stenciling and wheat pasting their way to large acclaim. So at this point, she's starting to notice, you know, a sort of like divide, a sort of like mainstreaming, while people who had been kind of making this art before, a lot of them people of color, you know, are participating in the arts in a way that is sort of dangerous, sort of extra legal. So there's sort of a divide there. And then she talks about, as you know, later on, a few years later, she does start to kind of find her way and meet like other women artists in this scene. In 2012, she had the opportunity to create a community mural with the theme of diversity in the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago. She sort of works with a local artist and friend, Adriana Baltasar. Adriana and I were contacted by Elevarte Community Studio. The women running Elevarte believed it was important for the mural opportunity to be headed by two local women artists. And she describes like the research process of like getting to know like the origins of the ethnic diversity of this neighborhood and like what the makeup is, sort of gets in touch with local artists who also are from the city to sort of create this together. And she says here, but it was amazing how many of our friends in the artist community came through to help. In the end, heart could have exploded from the beauty of all our hard work. I sat a long time at the curb across the street, admiring the massive mural and feeling so proud. And so, you know, it sort of brought a few questions or potential sort of contradictions here as far as thinking about like, you know, what the merits of public art are and, you know, the sort of nuance of like, well, like who are these local artists? Are they from the neighborhood? And like, who is this for? The sort of agency that neighbors and locals have in making their city look in the way that they want it to. And at the same time thinking, you know, like are pieces like these still contributing to the sort of rising rent in these immigrant neighborhoods at the same time? And this is a photo of her next to the really large handmade textile fabric display that she had created with Adriana. And now she's still an artist. She's a teaching artist in Chicago. She sort of moved forward and starts, you know, drawing dolls or like painting dolls, more like textile art, really colorful. She says near the end of the zine, to the right is Godzilla Girl, like the namesake of the zine. And it, to her, depicts that public art for me is like a huge roar, you know, is being heard. Since I was a teenager, I was always trying to find a way to connect and be heard. The truth is that graffiti was first ignited across the world by those without a voice in the system. Yeah, and you know, that is my presentation.
Hey, Claudia. Hello, so I'm back again, Jenna Freedman, the Zine Librarian. I, to be honest, wasn't sure that we were going to have time for my presentation, so I'm feeling a little bit anxious about it, but I am excited to talk about A Terrible, No Good, Very Bad Life, #2 by Keisha Hope. I love how she refers to her zine as her biomythology. She has a couple of literary references, as you'll notice. And I also just thought I would share a photo of Keisha as she looks now, because she did have a kind of terrible, no good, very bad life, but she is thriving now and gave enthusiastic permission to do this close reading of her zine. So you can see the zine was from 2010. So I pulled out this particular quote about what Keisha's school was like, that she was going to school in a gym, cafeteria, nursing office, daycare in the basement in the same neighborhood where I'm living now. So there's some real complications about gentrification and, you know, knowing that I'm, you know, sort of a descendant of this particular part of the gentrification of Flatbush. So I also want to do a bit of a visual reading of this zine, and I was struck by the images of the eggs, and the eggs have chickens on them, or maybe one has a bunny, but to me that like brings to mind this chicken and egg image, which makes me think about a lot of the issues of gentrification, or of just problems that seem impossible to solve because they're just so complicated and so so entwined or entrenched that you just don't even know where to start, and it just feels like a circular issue. And then so this on this next slide, I draw your attention to a page where Keisha has her first girlfriend, and her first girlfriend is telling her that she's beautiful. And, you know, so far Keisha has been living this terrible, horrible, no good, very bad life. And she's finally got someone who sees the beauty in her, and also who never makes fun of her for, you know, having government food in the fridge or wearing thrift store clothes. And I also want to draw your attention now to what to me looks like a cracked open egg. So in the top left and the bottom right of this page that I've teased out, it just looks like, you know, her life is breaking open. And then the next thing I want to draw your attention to is where Keisha is attending a Bad Brains concert. And for all of this time, you know, she's one of these people who punk saved her life. There are a lot of narratives of punk saved my life, but she's often in the punk scene the only person of color, the only Black woman in any given basement show or bigger show. And so she's got this punk band, Bad Brains, which is a band with Black members. And all of a sudden she can feel like the majority person instead of the minority. And like that just really, I'm just tuned into how that must have made her like feel seen and important in a way. And then I also was like moved and saddened by the statement, I'd sneak out to a couple midday shows because I wasn't allowed on the trains too late at night with all of the crazy white people. And that to me is an interruption of the narrative of Black neighborhoods being dangerous when it's actually white neighborhoods that are dangerous to Black people and other people of color. So the other thing that happened was Keisha got involved in the Riot Girl scene. And, you know, although she may have been welcomed into the scene, or at least maybe she didn't experience overt racism, it was still that she couldn't relate to the issues that the white girls in Riot Girl were complaining about. Her issues were like how gross government powdered milk was, or, you know, like shame and going to the doctor, or stealing bus tokens to buy candy. So I also was really moved by how relatable that is. Just for, I mean, I feel like there's just such a universal thing of kids stealing money to buy candy. Not that I did that, of course, but anytime I had access to money, I definitely was spending it on candy. Okay, so that is the end of our presentation. And again, we went a lot quicker than we did in our rehearsal. We hadn't thought that we were going to have time for questions, but it seems that we really may. I also just want to draw your attention to the fact that we have, that we've listed all the names and the call numbers of the zines, because we're a library staff and we want you to be able to find them. So with that, let me see, I think there was one or two other things I wanted to say. Oh, I also just, in case you missed it, we are sitting in the Zine Library. So you can see the Zine Library all around us. So I think what I'd love to do now, y'all, is let's stop sharing. And we'd love to hear questions or comments from folks. So I'm gonna give the seat back over to Claudia.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Hello.
Thank you. Any questions, any comments, or does this bring up anything for anyone?
I have a question.
Mhm.
I'm curious if there were other zines that you didn't include that you wanted to, or how you chose.
I can think of like a few other zines that I was thinking of. The tenants' rights organizer that I brought up earlier in my presentation, Patty from Mikako no Sukasa, collaborated on this zine, sort of reporting on like mutual aid projects that she was a part of during COVID. I always reference or suggest that zine to people. Check it out through interlibrary loan or stop by to look at it. Anybody else have any potential ones they were thinking of doing?
Well, I'm gonna like
Yeah,
swing
we can
this
just
over
move
here
this
for a sec.
around.
So just to back up for a minute, the way we chose our zines is first Mikako, who was part of the Undesign team, gave us a tour of the exhibit, which I think really opened a lot of our minds to what kinds of topics we could choose.
The sort of intersectionality, not necessarily looking up gentrification zines in the catalog, but all the sort of wide breadth of like material that relates to or affects gentrification.
I'm getting a little bit distracted by the really awesome comments in the chat. I just want to like further shout out my co-panelists and fellow Zine Library staff who like, I really just think that, yeah, that the zines they chose illuminated such a wide range of primary and secondary effects of gentrification. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely other zines that we had in mind. And I was just about to answer one of the questions that came in through the Q&A. All of the zines in our library are cataloged in Clio. So you could look up zines gentrification, or zines, if you're a librarian, you would look up zines gentrificat with an asterisk. And we I think used a couple of different search strategies to find them. But yeah, there's probably another 100 zines that we could have chosen. But also, Vanessa, I know that you had some zines in mind. Do you want to take a second and tell us what other zines you've encountered?
Yeah, I mean, I think zines are continue to be a really important format for organizers to be able to share information, which is great to see. And you still see people making zines and distributing them. But yeah, I just think it speaks to the goals of this project as a whole to undesign hierarchies, and to be able to look at these as primary sources. So really just excellent work, everyone. Yeah.
Thank you. Absolutely.
Claudia, someone's asking in the chat the name of your zine. Sorry, not the name, the zine that you just mentioned.
Oh, I think I wrote it down.
Yeah, not Monster Chica, but the other one.
It was Nos Cuidamos, Stories of Mutual Aid in Response to COVID and Bushwick. I could find you the link in a second.
Looks like there was another question about how do you find your zine artists? That may be more of a collections question.
Oh, sure. So we purchase zines. We have a collection development policy that centers women of color, including trans feminine folks, and then also trans women of all races and ethnicities. Right now we have a big cataloging backlog, so we're not collecting quite as expansively. And we also get a lot of zines by donation. So what typically happens is someone's either got the Marie Kondo bug, or their parents are moving out of their house and it's time to get the box of zines out of the basement or the attic. And that person will donate the zines to us. and also, again, we didn't expect to have so many times for questions. So I do really encourage people to email zines@barnard.edu to follow up with any of us.
Mhm. Yes, and here is Nayla on screen now.
One of the zines that I was looking at also was Inwood at the End of the World, and Inwood is mentioned in the Undesigned exhibit. So I was interested in looking if we had any zines on that, and we had a really interesting one that I read that was about like the Irish immigrants that were before like the Latin American immigrants that came into Inwood. And since that was such a big discussion recently, that was an interesting one to read and to understand like the cycles of gentrification. And yeah, that's also another zine that I recommend to read further on this issue of like gentrification, especially Inwood, something being close to both the exhibit and this community.
Yes.
So we still have time for a few more questions or thoughts. We're also like really just happy to hear what the presentations brought up for folks.
I like what Pamela just said. I'll just read that out loud. I'm so inspired by how open and honest some of the content is in the zines. I agree. And I think it's really freeing, in self-publishing, like you are your own editor. You choose what goes in or not goes in. You write your own headline, and so that kind of frees you up to like really express what you want to say and not have to censor yourself and like, in control over who reads it, sort of like control over that distribution process that I think is like really beneficial and a little healing to share it with people that are gonna, I don't know, empathize with you or know where you're coming from. Inwood Park is also the last piece of land in NYC that is not developed and natural. I haven't been. Where is Inwood Park?
Oh, I guess I don't know Inwood Park itself, but just Inwood is north of here.
Uptown.
Yeah. I'm hoping that more people will add some comments, but I'm also going to share that we have a zine workshop in 2 weeks that is free and open to the public, and folks are welcome to sign up. Oh, thanks, Jenny.
Ooh, thank you. Oh, community board rep of that district.
Oh, thanks.
Yes, follow Barnard Zine Library. If you can pull up our Spotify playlist link, Nayla, we have a playlist, Music Monday, where Nayla pulls music from zines. We have a lot of music zines also. Hey, Ogden.
Well, I'm inclined to just give folks back an extra 5 minutes in their lives. And yeah, we would love to have you, Pam, at the Electric Zine Maker Electric Workshop.
For sure. And Jenna and I are open, you could shoot us an email and we're always happy to have like consultations with folks on like zine making, either if it's like technical difficulty stuff or just like shooting ideas for how to make something yourself.
Yeah, so Mary, let's hand it back to you to do your closing.
Great. Thank you so much, Jenna, and thank you to the zine team. We really appreciate you putting this together and your hard work going through all the zines. This was really such a treat to sort of see what wonderful collections reside in the library. And if you are now inspired to make your own zine, please do log into the Zine Workshop that is in the chat. Up next, we have a short guided meditation. Once again, if you weren't able to join us earlier or you'd like to continue reflecting, Vera will lead a 15-minute meditation session
beginners are welcome, and we'll get that started around 2 o'clock. So if you'd like to take 5 minutes, get yourself settled, get a glass of water, walk around, do a little stretching or a dance break, whatever you need. We'd love to see you soon. Thank you so much, and we'll see you at 2.